I am Dick Crispo. I was born in New York City, January 13th, 1945. Came to Carmel in June of 1955 when my father moved the family produce business with his brothers to be headquartered in Salinas. This is the family business where it's had generations in the produce business. He came from Ciccione, just outside of Naples, Italy, and came to the United States, to New York, where he had a cousin that worked in the produce market, who got him a job with A.E. Cochran and Company, and he went there and became a salesman in 1903 and the head salesman in 1906, and by 1912 he was the managing partner and started developing his own labels, and later took over the company totally. He had the concept in mind that if you could eat salad in the wintertime, there was money to be made. And to do that, he had to bring the vegetables not only from Florida, where they traditionally, some came from there, and from Jersey in the summertime, but in the wintertime to have the crops coming in from California. So for this, they needed a type of lettuce to make a salad that would last of the trip, so it could hold up 7 days going across country in a rail car. And a man named Simpson developed the seed, and the seed is the actual name of the lettuce that we call iceberg lettuce is the Simpson lettuce from Mr. Simpson's seed. But the seed was developed for my grandfather to be able to carry it across country. To do that, they needed ice, and on putting ice on rail cars. On the rail cars, my grandfather would come in the summertime to California and contract with the growers and set up the contracts throughout the year. At that time, this is just before Bruce Church and Hardin and Ken Nutting and Merrill were younger. They were starting up with their own labels. This is a time when the farmer didn't have their own label. The label was put on by the wholesaler, the commission merchant in the particular city. My grandfather set up the practice of going across country by having the ice packed, thrown over the lettuce, and consequently, and he had it put on all his vegetables coming from California, and consequently on the family label it's always an iceberg, and consequently the name iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce comes from the fact this grows out of the need, as I said, just to make it shippable. By 1927, they had about 12 different labels using the iceberg as a symbol, that it was all the vegetables and fruits that came from California on ice into New York. This is the beginnings of what you have in the Salinas Valley, and later my father and his brothers, of which there was 11 brothers, of which 6 survived into adulthood. They were partners in the brokerage and distributing business, and Calzona Farms, where they pioneered desert farming. They were one of the first to farm in Yuma and El Centro, Phoenix, and in the desert. And this was the principle, was that, again, going back to having more crops in the wintertime. So a constant search for ways to feed the country in the wintertime seems to be the driving factor in the history of the produce in my family. My grandfather was a close friend with General Atterbury, the president of the New York Central Railroad. It was the New York Central Railroad that owned the freight lines coming into New York, going upstate New York, coming in from Chicago and connecting on up to California. General Atterbury there was no such thing as refrigerated cars. So the first time that the lettuce came in, it rotted his cars, and he was complaining about it. And then they brought some more in, and it rotted the cars. And he said, "You can't do this." Louis was my grandfather's nickname. "Louis, you can't do this. You're going to ruin all my freight cars." And Then my grandfather said, well, you're going to have to come up with some kind of refrigerated car. Some way we're going to have to, you have to move vegetables in the wintertime. And within 3 years, the New York Central Railroad had refrigerated cars. And the refrigerated cars is what we have today. But in the late 1920s, my grandfather was moving enormous amounts of fruits and vegetables on the cars. And General Atterbury and he were still friends. They used to ride around together. And he asked General Atterbury about trucks. And he said, what about trucks? Do you think trucks will be a threat to the train? And General Atterbury said, no, he couldn't see what trucks were good for. My grandfather, because he was on the train quite a bit, he had his own Pullman car. And because he made a lot of money coming up with this concept of having vegetables in the wintertime, he also loved to gamble and take chances in business, and he was always taking chances and trying new things. But he wasn't always, he was still an old Italian man at heart. And when one of his nephews came to him with this idea that said, if you take orange juice and you freeze it, you make orange juice and you freeze it, then you save it. And you could make a lot of money that way. This way you'd always have orange juice. And my grandfather said, nonsense. He, being an old Italian man, he said, nonsense, women love to squeeze oranges. The progression was that my Uncle Sal and my Uncle Victor were already out here in California. My father used to go to California.
Give me the dates if you can.
They were in the late 1940s, after World War II. They came out here. And those two brothers, which were my father being the oldest of the living brothers, had not come out. He goes to California quite a bit, but he still has Translux Crispo, which is a wire service, where he was one of the 10 largest users of the telephone, independent users of the telephone in the United States, and did primarily connecting. He was the networking for all the produce industry, kind of the Dow Jones. And when there was a connection there that didn't work out for him in terms of the business, he wanted to set up a business with his brothers in California, and he would run the Salinas part of it, and they would run the desert part of it. And because the family's businesses have always divided between the desert, the San Joaquin, and the Salinas Valley, they used to ship from California, Arizona, and Texas. So it was important that they each had their own geographical areas that they specialized in. My father's specialty being lettuce and the vegetables. My Uncle Sal being specialty being more the melons and that sort of thing.
What was your father's name?
Frank Crispo. And Frank had he was a broker and distributor. Plus, they were growers and shippers. They were at Calzona Farms, which was the farming end for the desert farming, where they did experimental farming for like the state of Kansas and Colorado. They did a lot of experiments and places to grow crops were row crops where they hadn't tried it before. Most of the time it didn't work out. Most of the time it's just where you see crops today is where it really where it works. They even tried it in a place called Carmel, Colorado. I think there's still a packing shed there somewhere up there. So one of those. At any rate, the governor of Colorado invited them in. This is the governor of Kansas State. They were willing to take chances. They love taking chances, and so they just go out and try things and see what worked and what didn't work. So they had that sense of adventure like my grandfather. There's no my Uncle Tony. Then my Uncle Tony came out from New York, where he was a wholesale merchant business, and was more of a sales specialist. So each one had different areas where they specialized in. My father was the broker distributor side more, and but they all had their own specialties, but they're all part of two companies, the Crispo brothers and Calzona Farms. The farming that my grandfather had done back in the 1920s was strictly contract, and usually with Japanese farmers were the first ones that he contracted with. He thought their quality of farmers were the best. And they then used to use ladybugs to put on the lettuce because it attacked the aphid, which was the enemy of the lettuce. And so they didn't have chemicals until after World War II on the iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce did not have chemicals until after World War II. And it was after World War II that and I remember this because I was probably about 5 when I was eating dinner. My father came home, this is in New York, and said to my mother, they're going to pack lettuce in cardboard boxes and they're going to suck it out somehow in some kind of sucking out the water in some kind of vacuum. He says, well, that's the vacuum cooler. And the vacuum cooler took the water out. Of course, what it did was it takes the nutrients out of the lettuce, right? But it made it so it could ship, and it stayed better in the shipping process. So that's the coolers all over the Salinas Valley. And of course, now the Salinas Valley has great interest in organic farming, right? I mean, they're going back to that. But they did organic farming before World War II. They did it. That's how they did it. The idea of the contracting came to be because if you contracted so much land with the farmer said then you'd know how much you had coming on the market at the time and how much you needed for you to be, because my grandfather supplied from Albany all down to New York City along the Hudson River, so you needed to supply it. And he moved 3/4 of the produce coming into the city of New York. Eventually, he controlled that amount with his ability to be marketing and stuff. The produce when I was a kid, we used to go out in the 1950s. We go out to places like Huron, Fireball, Mendota, out there in the San Joaquin Valley. And these incredibly hot temperatures, and we'd stay at the hacienda in Fresno, and we'd leave after a couple of weeks, but we had to do this trek out there, and all these produce people be all hanging around there with their short white sleeve shirts, brown pants, and cigars in their pockets. It's an interesting combination of this. They all look like that. This is a uniform. Right, the concept of putting ice in the cars. And so because there was ice on the vegetables, my grandfather came up with the term ice, using the image of an iceberg. This is totally new. This is something that's not done before. And I think it's Union Ice and a couple other ones in Salinas, they became major ice producers, and they produced, I think, if I remember right, late 1940s, they were still producing more ice than any other place in the country. It was produced right here in Salinas. The iceberg, the label that says iceberg on it is my grandfather's original. And the tomatoes, the cantaloupes, the honeydews, the peas, all these various vegetables, all had the iceberg on it because they all moved on ice.
All right.
The name Crispo lends itself to the brand, and so before my grandfather had the company totally in his name, he had this label, and the label starts with Crispo, and you can see here the iceberg in the middle here, and carrots, and there's honeydews and tomatoes, chicory, and peas, and cantaloupe. Now you don't see broccoli because broccoli doesn't come until the 30s. But the Dorigo brothers developed broccoli with my grandfather to market it in New York for the Italian population, because the broccoli was an Italian vegetable, and who else could you sell it to? At the time they thought, who else are you going to sell it to? So that's important that it lends itself to that. The name Crispo comes first from Pisa, and then it's in Sicily, and then up in Naples. Naples was a part of the kingdom of the two Sicilies, and so southern Italy, many times the names in Sicily and the names in Naples are the same. And they were also the family of politicians and fishermen in Sicily. For example, they were captains of the fishing fleet at Ahi, and they were also court magistrates and senators and things like that. But the name is the original name, and the name is, I can trace the name back to 1312 as far as I've been able to do it. So we tried, they had a need for diversifying all the time and keep adding more vegetables that could be shipped. And broccoli being a popular Italian, of course, there's more Italians in the 1920s in New York than there was in Rome. So it was, you see, you had a need to bring in some Italian vegetables. So what happened was that the Dorigo brothers, they were starting to farm. They were Italian, they farmed, and they said to bring on broccoli. And they brought broccoli in there so my grandfather could. My grandfather was a close friend with Giannini. The Bank of America was then the Bank of Italy. So they would call up my grandfather in New York and say, "Is this farmer? You know this farmer? Do you have a contract with this farmer? Should I loan him money?" Well, that's the kind of thing that's very tight. The Italian-American community worked that way, you know, because like any immigrant community, they have to hang tight together to make it. And of course, Giannini's Bank of Italy became the Bank of America. No, Giannini, he became friends after the earthquake.
Yeah, the earthquake is what made Giannini.
Nini, because he opened the vault.
Yeah, he opened the vault, got money out, and walked out on the street with a suitcase full of money and started loaning it to people. Good thinking, man.
Can I ask one question real quick?
Sure.
My mother-in-law always calls cauliflower broccoli when she's a Sicilian. Is there really a difference? I mean, I know there's a difference to us. It's white and green, but was it originally one vegetable or something?
As far as I know, no, it's two vegetables.
They called them
But,
broccoli.
you know, you had different names in different parts of Italy because they didn't speak Italian until Mussolini. Everybody didn't speak it, you know. That was the time. Gugazzil, and my grandmother comes from Adina Lugano in Salerno, south of Naples, and Gugazzil. Gugazzil is zucchini. I mean, that's, so you're going to have, comes up different ways. At Franklin and Murray Streets in which is now the Tribeca area of New York. This is where my grandfather had his business, the produce distribution and commission merchant business, and these were the horses that pulled when the train loads came in. These are the horses that distributed them up through the city. And then they went up further up the Hudson River on barges and things like that. But primarily, the distribution in New York City was in the horses, these horse carts.
What year do you think?
This year is about 1926. 1927. This is part of the celebration that we'll see here, is the celebration of the 100th car of iceberg lettuce arriving in New York. In this big celebration, they had parades, they had bands, they had banners, they had all this sort of thing for it, because they had bet that it wouldn't work, that they wouldn't be able to do it. And he's showing them that this is that the 100th car, freight car, has come through, and it came through fine. And so there, you know.
That's great.
This is my grandmother and grandfather, and these are some of his employees in New York. And he had large parties. Being a good Italian, he always had lots of parties, lots of dancing, lots of celebrations, and he always included his employees in the celebrations.
Dressed in tuxedos.
Then they're usually probably relatives, some distant relative or something that he gave a job to when they came here. He also bought up a lot of property in New York, and he came parts of Brooklyn, was a couple of blocks in Brooklyn, for example, housing a lot of his cousins and things that came afterwards. You know, when you become successful immigrant, you have to bring all your relatives with you. So he had to bring all his relatives, and then he had to house them, and then he had to take care of them, and they give them jobs. So everybody gets a job. This is my grandfather, Emilio Crispo, my grandmother, Amelia Crispo. She came to the United States twice because her mother came and didn't like it, and they went back to her town, Adina, and they came again a couple of years later. They were married when she was the ripe old age of 15, and he was about 19 or 20. other people in the pictures here are his employees that are usually related to cousins and other immigrants that have come, that he gave jobs to. He gave jobs and housing and everything for a lot of his workers. He was the president of the Society of the People from Naples, and the Festival of San Gennaro in New York. And my Aunt Viola, who was the only daughter, he had 12 sons and had 11 sons and one daughter, and she was the queen of the Festival of San Gennaro, and I still go to that festival in New York. It's the celebration of the people from Naples, from San Gennaro, that saved them from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius.
You want to try to name the 12 kids?
Okay, there's my father.
Mark, Luke, John.
No, I can't give you all. I can give you some. My Uncle Paul that lives here still, he was a retired opera singer. My Uncle Victor lives in Phoenix. My Uncle Sal has passed away. My Uncle Tony has passed away. Those were the ones active in the produce in their adult years. My Uncle George died. He was older than my father. He died from walking pneumonia. Younger, he was to be a doctor, possibly a congressman. We had hopes. They had hopes that they would have a congressman in the bunch, and something like that. You know, all the usual immigrant dreams.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, lawyer, engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the 1903. Yeah. This is 1903, 1905, and then it says in here the dates that he took over the sales position. My grandfather, when he came from Italy, could not read or write in English. So, but his sister-in-law had gone to school in the United States for a couple of years, and she could write 1 to 100. So she wrote 1 to the 100 for him, and he put it in his derby hat. And so he could look in the hat when he needed to know the numbers when he was selling produce and things. He would look in his hat and get the number. And he used this derby until he had the numbers memorized. This is the actual 1 to 100 sheet of paper. My grandfather used to send, my father's Frank Crispo. He was born in 1910. He died in 1995. He used to come out as a young man, as a teenager, for my grandfather in the summertime to California. My grandfather hoped that he would stay in California and starting operations in California. My father didn't like the idea, went to Chicago and started his own business. In the height of the Depression, he started very successful as a man in his late teens, early 20s, his own produce business. And he had set up in Chicago his, let's see, the man's name, Mattori, who's Johnny Mattori, was the man, and they were lifelong friends. And Joe Mattori, and there's Joe and Johnny, and there's a couple others. And they had a business in Chicago, and they hired a woman from the Giorgio Fruit Company who was a secretary, and that was my mother was my mother, and she went to work with my father as a secretary and bookkeeper. And in the height of the Depression, when things were very hard, he went and bought her a brand new yellow Buick convertible. That kind of impressed her, and I guess that's was a good show. So anyway, she had been married before and had my sister. Then they moved when things were looking bad for my grandfather. He was losing his business. My father came back to New York, and my grandfather had the house that he had bought and remodeled in Brooklyn was a New York Senator Miller's house, and he had it all redone. His house is fascinating to me as an artist because he hired the artisans from Naples to come and paint frescoes on the ceilings and stuff, and then he had the the furniture people from my grandmother's area near Salerno come, and they lived in the house for 2 years and made all the furniture. So the house was really a total work of art, and in the stupidity of the 50s, the 1950s, when they tore down so many things, and that house got torn down. My father came always loving, so there was a great love of art in the family, there always was. And having the one uncle that was an opera singer who's always, I always felt close to because we were both the ones in the arts. We had a long, close relationship, my uncle and I, which we still do.
His name again?
Paul Crispo, and he lives on Cannery Row, where my parents had their antique shop. The connection with antiques came when my family, I introduced my family to Asian art, and my mother was very interested, my father was interested, and then my father decided to make a business out of it, and he kept doing his produce business, but on a reduced scale, where he just did the brokerage part of it. And they opened up the house of Crispo on Cannery Row. My cousin Ted Balistreri was opening the sardine factory. My father had sent him to hotel and restaurant school. And my father had his family his sister come out, and so we all grew up together out here too. But we used to go in the summertime. They always came out to Connecticut, where we had a house out there, and I'd go into Brooklyn in the wintertime. We always trade-offs in the winter, so we always had this kind of, we're always together. And my father's, when he opened that business is when, and Ted was on Cannery Row. I had been on Cannery Row at the other end, down by Calisa's, when I had a studio down there in '67. So the family was familiar with Cannery Row, and and Ted was opening a restaurant, the China Row restaurant, and so my father opened up the antique shop across the street, and then they decided to sell their house in Carmel Valley and live above the store, which they had never done anything like that in their life, but they're going to try it, and my mother liked it, and my father liked it, so they stayed there for almost 20 years. And they collected Asian art from all bronzes and ivories and beautiful collections, and bought up a lot of private collections and things. And then when my father was very active in Cannery Row and wanted things to get, he was in the developmental side of Cannery Row, not the, as more in the end, both on the preservation side where he preserved the houses there, but he also was on the developmental side in terms of wanting more businesses and things, and was helpful in getting the aquarium here instead of going to Santa Cruz. He became friends with Packard and was active and was close friends of Ben Swig. And so when they sold the Cannery Row company, and then Ben Swig still had some property, and Ben Swig and my father loved to do business together, different businesses, and they would write things like they would write agreements on lunch bags and things like that. I mean, it was old time business, and they didn't have no use for this, all these pounds of paper and lots of contracts. So my father was semi-retired when he took over, when he got more and more active in the antique business. My mother totally took into the shop and using her business and management skills, and I would come in there as an appraiser and things like that. I came here when I was 10, and I was very lonely. There was nobody around. You know, there wasn't a lot of kids in Carmel. It was not like Monterey where you had lots of people to play with. Carmel, you didn't. You went for blocks and blocks. You didn't have kids. And I was down at Carmelo in 12th while they were busy getting ready to build a house in Carmel Valley. We were living in Carmel. There just wasn't any kids around. All summer. I went all summer long. My cousins weren't out here yet. I didn't know what the hell. This was crazy. I mean, what is this place? It's got fog in the summertime and no kids, right? So I'd go to the beach and I'd walk around and, you know, and I'd start, I'd go in to walk into town or something, and I'd see some, because there were only 3 or 4 galleries in town at the time. The following year I decided that's what I wanted to do, was to be an artist. and I was very fortunate because at the time the artists in Carmel were more part of the town. They were walking around. They were there. It wasn't like, you know, it wasn't like in the wintertime there was hardly anybody in town. So you had lots of people I could talk to. In high school, I studied with a lot of different artists. I would go to their houses and say, I'd like to study with you. Is that possible? My sister, when this one summer, and she was getting married in the summer of I think it was 1960, we went to Buck Warshawski's house on Soledad and Pacific and I knocked on his door, and then we went in. This kind of Igor character and opens the door for me, and he says, you know, the master will see you, all this kind of stuff. There's these giant tapestries hanging off balconies and all this stuff, and I went, my God, this is and this is all dusty and the big skylights and everything. And here he comes out with on two canes with this aluminum easel, and here's this woman sitting up there posed in this drapery with all this tapestries behind her. And he says, you have to spend more time drawing. I had been entering art shows, and when I was in the 8th grade, I won a couple of local prizes. I was fortunate to Nancy Johnson, when she had Nancy's Artist Palette, gave me a show in not a show, but a show in her window of my pastel landscapes. I was 11 years old then. Anyway, what happened was that eventually I just kept studying with as many people as I could, adult school, and I went to adult school life drawing classes when I was 13 and 14, and when I was 16 they told me I couldn't go, you know, as nude models, so they said at 16 you can't go. When I was 18 I was allowed back in the classes again. It was that kind of crazy kind of thing that, you know, when you're young in the arts, that's, you don't have anything to do. But I always found the artists to work with. I was at the Carmel Art Institute for 3.5 years with John Cunningham. And I go to a lot of private instructors, Victor DiGesso and Janet, Sam Colburn. I go out and paint with him. I go find anybody I could to paint with. I went to MPC, Hartnell, UC Santa Cruz, wherever was available. Eventually ended up with a Master's of Fine Arts degree, which is about as worthless a degree you can have. I mean, that and 10 cents, you know, you got 10 cents, and that's it. So, over the years, I've made a life for myself in the arts and doing social political commentary and my landscape work and my study of ethnographic studies and my collection of folk art that I gave to the museum in '73, based on the fact that it set up the Museum on Wheels. And it's really, for me, been a lifetime in art, but art connected to the community. The community is a very important part of my life. That's why I do my lecture series, my connections with the Art Association, which I've been a member since 1969. And it's just real important that I'm not isolated from the community. Now, when I'm working, I like to be by myself, except when I'm doing the mural projects, then I'm in the public eye. But it's up to 70-some-odd murals, 73 murals. I only have 9 left, and I haven't been doing as many lately over the past few years. It's been something that I don't do very often anymore.
Do you want to talk about the prison thing?
The prison, I did I was at Soledad Prison on a California Arts Council grant, Artists and Social Institutions grant. And the grant was to paint the corridor, which is a half a mile long and a quarter mile on each side, so it's half a mile of painting, which made it the longest indoor painting in the world. And the prison opened. I had 10 paid inmates and 10 volunteer inmates, where they got the first pay numbers. We developed the first pay numbers for art in the California prison system. $15 a week in early showers. Early showers being the most important part that you could possibly get, and being exempt from lockdowns unless you're involved in the problem. We closed it up on time. We finished the mural on the 10th month, one day short of when the budget ended, and the California Arts Council money ran out. And we had a first banquet in there in the library, and we celebrated. And we had invited outside guests, came to the prison to a banquet celebrating this mural in the what then was, not anymore because they've changed the custody of the prison. Then was the maximum security area of the prison. I then went on to set up the Arts and Corrections program, which is where I did the pilot programs for there in that Vacaville Psych Ward and at Folsom and at Soledad, but primarily at Soledad, based at Soledad. And I would go down to the camps in San Luis Obispo at California Men's Colony and do some work down there once in a while. What I like to have children, leave for children, and to have children remind them is to cherish their heritage, to cherish who they are and where they came from, and not to be afraid of who they are. But who they are is everybody is a wonderful gift, and we live in a mosaic. And it's a wonderful mosaic, and they're part of the mosaic. And each part, like any mosaic, each stone is the gift to the mosaic. And to not get lost in the shuffle, but to remain who you are. As I said before, when I came from New York in summer of '55, it didn't make sense to me at all. I mean, the fog and the lack of kids at all. What I've come to love about it is, besides the obvious beauty, which is very important to me, which is what I paint now, it's just the beauty of it, and trying to not just capture it, because that's kind of I'm not interested in making a postcard of it, but also in preserving it and keeping its uniqueness. It's very unique. It's very different than other places, and I travel quite a bit, and no matter where I go, there's uniqueness about this that I come home to. And it's only been in recent years that I really have come home in that sense of feeling totally at home here. And that's what I've been able to do in the second half of my life now, being 54, feeling more, kind of comfortable with that factor. For me, the peninsula and its diversity. And when I was a student, in my student days, we still had a wide variety of artists and people who were doing some very interesting things. And I'd like to hold on to that memory and challenge people to come up always with new things, new ideas, new ways of working. At the same time, remembering where they live in this kind of special place, away from the usual grind and groan of the area of America. I paint studies on panels, and then I work them into the larger paintings through photographs and doing these quick oil sketches. And so I may do 3 or 4 of these on the spot. This is down at the Wildcat Creek Cove in the Highlands on a stormy, dark day. And this is I love winter because so this is just the gestures of the winter storm when the water's overlapping the Carmel Beach, when the Carmel Beach vanishes. It's one of my favorite times to paint the Carmel Beach is when it's not there. And this is these are the sketches. There'll be larger paintings coming in there. This is an underpainting this is Point Lobos looking up from down on the Riley Ranch. And up in the Riley Ranch, looking down, that's Point Lobos. But it's a different view of Point Lobos then.
I live on the Riley Ranch. That little red house right across from
Oh yeah.
The porch all around.
Yeah.
That's where my son
Yeah, this is the top part, up in the top hills.
You can see how he's drawing that. This is the point up there.
Yeah. So all this hot will be underneath, and then this one you wouldn't even see these colors. They'd just be affecting the colors that's in there. Octavio Paz. I go to Mexico quite a bit. Mexico is very important to me. Obviously, I still consider California part of Mexico in a way. I mean, they may have lost the battle, but they won the war, kind of thing. This is Octavio Paz done. I was in Mexico when he died, in Mexico City last year, when he died, and I came back and painted this in memory of him. one of my favorite poets, Mexico's leading poet, and a man who best summarized the Mexican spirit in literature. And so I painted this. I have 3 or 4 pieces, let's see, about 4 pieces in large public collections in Mexico. At the Museum of Modern Art, one at the Bellas Artes, I have woodcuts. At the Bellas Artes, the Museum of Modern Art, and at the University of Guadalajara. My work in public collections is in about a little over 30 public collections, ranging in about a dozen different countries. I have done about 73, 74 murals across the United States, most of which have been painted out or destroyed. I'm in over 300 private collections, and I have I spent a lifetime of teaching and working with the community and community arts, and working in the various, I work in all 2-dimensional media: oils, acrylic, watercolor, printmaking, monotype, gouache, lithography, etching, whatever comes along. If it's 2-dimensional, I do it. I served on the board of Cubo, the original bilingual broadcasting company, when Jimmy Carter was president. He had funded for bilingual radio. I love the idea of a bilingual radio station. I remember the Italian Hour in New York, which was in Italian. Now people say they don't want bilingual, they don't want to have these bilingual languages. Well, I remember in New York the language, the language was Italian. My grandmother listening to the Italian show, brought to you by Buitoni, a spaghetti company. So I mean, this business of it's part of the mosaic.